upper crust.
Right.
Or very near to the upper crust. So Everard Fielding he sort of played two roles. Prior to the First World War, Fielding for years was the secretary of the Society for Psychical Research. And that was a kind of broad, spiritual, paranormal, what we would call it now is a sort of paranormal investigation organization.
Okay.
It saw itself in some ways as the sort of the equivalent of the Royal Geographic Society. The Society for Psychical Research was formed back, I think, in the 1880s, 1890s. Again, attracted the attention of people from sciences across society. Not what you would expect as a collection of sort of insignificant kooks. They may have been kooks, they may not have been. They weren't insignificant.
Right.
Fielding was the secretary of this society, and one of the things they engaged in was a lot of investigation of, particularly spiritualism and of people, of mediums. This is also how they sort of connect together with Houdini, who gets interested in this as well. And they exposed a great many of them. And others they thought might be legitimate. They were interested in what they saw as a sort of scientific exploration of, again, what we would now call the paranormal.
Right.
Crowley is a good friend of Fielding, and in fact, in the years before the war, Crowley participates in some of these investigations, and really quite objectively. I mean, he was someone who came to this. It's worth saying that he generally speaking detested mediums.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things that if you look at the general views of Houdini and you look at the views towards spiritualism of Crowley, whatever the other difference is, there's a kind of convergence of opinions on that. So Crowley and Fielding and the Society for Psychical Research are there before the war. When the war breaks out, Fielding goes into intelligence. And he spends the whole First World War in one branch or another of British intelligence. And he's the fellow who essentially recruits Crowley for his wartime mission. He becomes, in effect, Crowley's case officer. Because whenever Crowley runs into trouble, even if he's in New York, somehow he always manages to get back to Fielding. So here's this continuity between a peacetime, paranormal, investigative society, the friendship between Crowley and Fielding, which during the war turns into a professional relationship linked to intelligence.
Okay.
And those are the type of things. I mean, that's maybe the single best example, but there's the same sort of connections that run through much the rest of Crowley's life. Most of the people in the 1930s, for instance, towards the end of his life, Crowley is closely connected to a fellow by the name of Robin Thine, a guy I'd never heard of before. I'd actually run across Fielding's name in a couple places, but Robin Thine, he proved to be a very difficult character to pin down. I mean, it was hard to figure out exactly. You would get these references that he died suddenly in the mid-30s, but then it was very strange and convoluted to figure out what it was that he died of, or where, or other circumstances. Thine is one of these people who had some. The British government was very, very interested in him. Somebody went to great expense to fly in a doctor from Switzerland to try to keep him from dying. Thine, again, is one of these people with intelligence connections as well. So from the beginning, the early part of Crowley's life till the end, it ebbs and flows. I mean, there are periods. I think certainly in the book, through much of the 20s, Crowley's kind of an outcast. And there are things I suggest that he probably screwed up on. I'm not sure he was the best secret agent that anyone could possibly have.
He had a few too many vices, I think, to be too good at it.
Well, I think that he was distracted by a lot of things.
Right.
Heroin addiction was one of them.
Yeah.
His various adventures in romance was probably another as well. I mean, Crowley was I'll go back to this thing that I mentioned to begin with in terms of how my views towards him changed. And I think certainly by the time I was finished with the book, I felt that, well, you can always claim that you have more understanding of someone, which is easy to do, just claim that when you've never actually physically met them. But nevertheless, as much as I could, I think I had more understanding of him, not again so much from his interest in the occult, but just as a person. I had a lot more sympathy for him.
Okay.
But that isn't saying that I'm totally sort of won over to his side. He was a guy with a lot of vices. And, I would tend to agree, let's put it this way, I would not loan him money.
Yeah.
I would never let my daughter anywhere near him.
Yeah.
Nor my wife. And I sort of agree with the people, someone who once said that they would, they sort of liked him, but they would never leave their children alone with him.
Right.
And, again, he was extremely self-centered. To the point of absolute cruelty to people around him. He was a guy who managed to burn most of the bridges he had. I think he was a difficult person.
Right.
And very few of his relationships endure through his life. And I think that was certainly one of the things that made him problematic as an intelligence asset. But on the other hand, what made him useful, I think, right up to the end, or near the end of his life, was that he had connections, that he had access to information that other people didn't have, or they couldn't get quite so easily. And there again is an example of this that I note in the book. This is, it's around the mid-1920s, when he's living in France. He hasn't gone back to Britain for years. And actually appears to be very reluctant to do so, and probably nobody much wanted him to do that, and he's been down on his leg. It's a very low point in his life. But there's some documents that crop up on the British side, and the sort of conversations between the Foreign Office and a fellow who's in British intelligence, in fact, had been involved with MI6, and they're curious about basically this Russian mystic, a guy by the name of Nikolai Roerich, which some people may have heard of, and he's also connected to intelligence, by the way. But Nikolai Roerich, they were suspicious of him because they thought he was, in his explorations in the Himalayas, was a Soviet agent, which they were absolutely right about. And they were trying to get information about him. And so they approached this one fellow, and he rather reluctantly says, well, I know a guy, Aleister Crowley, who has a lot of information about Asiatic freaks and mysticism, and he probably can give us some kind of insight on that. Now here again, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but that's roughly what he tells them. But this certainly meets a great deal of opposition. There's a lot of reluctance. It's like, I almost don't want to mention his name. But if you're really sort of looking for this, I might be able to get a hold of him to see what he knows. And you can clearly see in some of the other exchanges, it's like, well, other people sort of want to hold their nose. Others make it clear they want absolutely nothing to do with it.
Right.
And I think part of that had to do with his reputation, which by this time point was quite bad. But I think it's also connected to some sort of reservations about his usefulness. But still, to get that type of information, the point was there's only sort of one guy that we could go to who might be able to help us, and whether we have to hold our nose dealing with him or not, whatever else we may think about him, he is a potential asset. And I think this is one of the things that sort of draws him back into. I think it's Crowley's connection to German occult circles that brings him back into the intelligence fold about the beginning of the 1930s, and is one of the main reasons he's hanging around Weimar Germany as the Nazis are coming to power.
Right. Can we? I was taking notes while I was rereading it, and I think maybe we could go through kind of biographically and just mention a few episodes where he's kind of curiously in a place of importance.
Yeah.
For the British. like maybe to start with, you kind of theorize that perhaps his splitting up of the Golden Dawn was had to do with his intelligence duties.
Well, that was again one of those things that really surprised me, because I wasn't expecting to find much there. And people who are acquainted with his career, and I don't want to presume too much, but the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, or just the Golden Dawn for short, was it was a takeoff. It was a kind of specialized takeoff on Rosicrucianism, which itself was a kind of takeoff or a specialized takeoff on Freemasonry. And Crowley himself sort of passed through those organizations as well. And that came together again at the end of the 19th century. He joined it in the late 1890s. I mean, the organization had been around for a while. And it had its, like most of these groups do, it had its personal differences within it. It also had some doctrinal differences. It probably would have come apart at the seams anyway, but what I began to note, just sort of standing back and looking at it, is that Crowley comes along, he's promoted into the organization, especially this fellow by the name of Samuel MacGregor Mathers, sort of, who was one of the old men of the organization's championed him, moved him along. Other people in the Golden Dawn thought he was moving him along too quickly, didn't like Crowley personally. And eventually, the tensions that he didn't necessarily create, but which he brought to this peak, tore the organization apart. And it never really recovers from that.
Right.
And so, Crowley enters the Golden Dawn, and in short order, the whole thing blows up. And most of this has to do with him. Now, that could be one of those things that it's just a matter of personalities clashing with each other. But then I began to explore a little bit more into some of the political affiliations of the Golden Dawn. So the question was, is there more here than just interest in occultism?
Right.
And that's where you begin to find out that MacGregor Mathers and others, there was a whole current running through the Golden Dawn that might roughly be called Celtic revivalism. So this is where you're looking. You can find people who are connected to. There's a lot of Irish nationalism within it, and there's also Scottish nationalism. But within that, there's also something that I didn't really expect to find. There's what in British politics is often called Jacobism. For anybody who knows their English history, back before the German Georgies came along, George the First, the Second, and Third, all those ones we're familiar with slightly. There were the good old Tudor Stuarts, going back to Henry VIII and his dad and Elizabeth and the rest, and that dynasty is overthrown in the 17th century, but its adherents always believed that the House of Hanover are a group of German usurpers. And they were actually, if you go back to the 18th century, there are rebellions in Scotland and even in England in an attempt to restore the Stuarts to the throne. And it was one of those things that I sort of imagined, must have run its course, back in 1750. Well, it turns out there weren't many of them. But into the 19th and even at the beginning of the 20th century, there's this restorationist current, this legitimists, they call themselves. And these were people, MacGregor Mathers is one of them, who wants to restore the rightful Stuart dynasty to the British throne. And they keep that rather low-key, but that also combines together with this revivalist, Celtic nationalism, Irish nationalism, and it also reaches out and connects with other legitimist movements across Europe. And one of these connections is to replace the king in Spain. And in fact, throughout the 19th century, Spain had been sort of torn apart by civil wars over which basic branch of the Bourbon family was going to rule the place. And this is where I find out that Crowley is mixed up about